Poorly supplied and untrained colonists beat an army of formidable British redcoats backed by the power of the Royal Navy? But he did succeed, aided by British strategic miscalculations, French logistical and military aid, and the sheer enormity of Britain trying to control an area the size of the eastern United States with an 18th-century army. Washington may not have been a great battle captain of Napoleonic caliber, as evidenced by his disastrous New York campaign of 1776. Yet by Bonaparte's standards, he could be considered lucky, as when he exploited British mistakes to win the Battle of Trenton and restore flagging American morale. However, his real genius was strategic insight. He simply realized that as long as he kept the Continental Army intact and able to strike, the British could never consolidate control of their former colonies. Since 1943, America has become accustomed to launching amphibious assaults of overwhelming strength. D-Day and Tarawa were tough battles, but at least the attackers were backed by massive resources. When Scott landed at Veracruz, Mexico in March 1847, he was conducting the largest American amphibious assault until World War II. But where Eisenhower at Normandy could land 150,000 men backed by enormous naval and air support, Scott had just 10,000 men. Yet he marched 200 miles from his beachhead to Mexico City, fought and won several battles against Mexican forces that were sometimes superior in numbers, and seized the Mexican capital. And he did so on a slender logistical thread while deep in enemy territory. Granted that Santa Anna's army of the Mexican-American War wasn't exactly Hitler's Wehrmacht. Or, that the U.S. force was a who's who of future Civil War stars, including Lee, Grant, and Jackson. Nonetheless, Scott made intrepid and skillful use of what he had to win what turned America into a continental power. Grant or Lee? Lee or Grant? Trying to decide which general was better will trigger debate and tempers until America itself is but a memory. But ultimately, Grant gets the nod, because he had a keener sense of the military realities of the war between the states. Yet winning battles doesn't equate to winning conflicts, as Germany also learned in 2 world wars. To win, the Confederacy had to survive in the face of stronger Union military and economic resources, until war weariness induced the North to accept Southern independence. For this to happen, the South needed strong armies, but only strong enough to parry Union thrusts and convince the Yankees of the futility of their efforts. Every battle fought by Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia, even if it made fools of McClellan, Hooker and the Army of the Potomac, was one more battle that bled Confederate manpower. Obviously, winning battles is a path to victory. But to what end did Bull Run and Chancellorsville lead? The Army of the Potomac was not destroyed, Washington and other northern cities were not captured, and the Union fought on. Grant saw that to win, the Union had to keep a death grip upon the Army of Northern Virginia, engaging the cream of the Confederate armies while Sherman's armies devastated their way through the South. Grant was no more a butcher than Lee. Pickett's charge was as bloody and futile as Cold Harbor, but he knew that the road to victory could not be won bloodlessly. If any one man deserves credit for America's victory in World War II, it is Marshall. When he became U.S. Army Chief of Staff in 1939, he inherited an army smaller than that of Romania and led by decrepit old generals unfit to lead a Boy Scout troop. By 1945, manhunt that required Hathcock to cross enemy lines to dispatch a North Vietnamese army general. He went 4 days without food, water, or sleep, crawling inch by inch, on his side, to safely get within range of the general. At 700 yards, he took out the target and then sneaked back to safety. Hathcock also held the record for the longest confirmed kill shot for over 30 years, at 2,500 yards. His record was beaten in 2002 by both Canadian Master Corporal Aaron Perry and Corporal Rob Furlong, with 2,526-yard and 2,657-yard kill shots, respectively. Both of those shots occurred in 2002 during the war in Afghanistan. Hathcock claimed that his only motivation as a sniper was to do his duty and protect his fellow Marines. U.S. Army Scout William Billy Dixon was a marksman famed for one of the longest kill shots in combat, at 1,538 yards. Dixon was an American buffalo hunter and scout in the Texas Panhandle in the 1800s. He learned how to hunt game out of necessity as a young boy, which helped him grow into an exceptional marksman. Dixon is one of only 8 civilians to ever receive the U.S. Medal of Honor. Prior to joining the U.S. Army Scouts, Dixon led founders of Adobe Walls to the Texas Plains in 1874. 28 men and women from the group were attacked by an estimated 1,000 Native American Indians. Dixon ended the attack by making his 1,538-yard kill shot. At the time it was dubbed the shot of the century. The shot also spooked the assailants, causing them to retreat. 2 veterans who gained public attention based on their success in combat include Navy SEAL Brandon Webb and Army Ranger Sergeant Nicholas Irving, with both winding up in the media spotlight after leaving the military. Their personas are controversial and compelling, so we feature them below. Brandon Webb was a certified SEAL sniper. He deployed 4 times, once with SEAL Team 3 to Afghanistan. After his final deployment, Webb worked at the Naval Special Warfare Group 1 Sniper Cell. He ran the sniper program at the Navy Special Warfare Command as the SEAL Sniper Course Manager, where he trained nearly 300 SEALs from 2003 to 2006, including the legendary American sniper Chris Kyle. When Webb left the Navy, he became a New York Times best-selling author and an entrepreneur. He is the co-author of The 21st Century Sniper, a complete practical guide. He's also written The Red Circle, The Making of a Navy SEAL, The Power of Thought, Core Principles to Overcome Adversity and Achieve Success, Total Focus, The Killing School, and Among Heroes. In 2018, his newest book, Mastering Fear, will be released. The Special Forces community has mixed opinions about Webb and his books. However, most agree that he has elevated SEALs to celebrity status. Webb is often the go-to subject matter expert for providing insight to the media regarding special ops missions, and he has contributed to media outlets such as Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times. CG-76 Flak Zielgerät, Anti-Aircraft Target Device, 79, or better known as the Flying Bomb or V-1. For Hitler, the V-1 offered a means of retaliation for the incessant Allied bombing campaign against Germany without the risk of bomber losses on Germany's part. Codenamed Kirschen, Cherry Stone, the V-1 program was instituted at Peenemünde. The V-1 resembled a small plane with a stovepipe over its tail and no cockpit. It was about 25 feet long, with a 17-foot wingspan. The jet engine, which was housed in the stovepipe assembly, was fueled by 80% octane petrol. It carried a 1-ton warhead and was launched by an inclined catapult or launching ramp 158 feet in length. The bomb flew along a preset gyroscopic controlled course. Although it was not very accurate, it was accurate enough to hit its intended objective, London. Commencement of the missile attack on the British capital, codenamed Target 42, was scheduled for Christmas Day 1943, but endless technical difficulties in the V-1's manufacture pushed the strike date back to the summer of 1944 when 5,000 operational V-1s were finally ready to be sent against London. The operation was put under the control of Lieutenant General Erich Heinemann's LXV Army Corps. The missile offensive would be carried out from more than 95 launch sites. These were mostly small facilities with ski-shaped buildings designed to protect the personnel firing the missiles from explosions set off by unassembled flying bombs. During December 1943, 52 of these sites were bombed by Allied air units, resulting in the complete destruction of 7 sites. In response to the relentless Allied bombing, detachments of anti-aircraft guns were positioned around each installation. Despite this added protection, by January 1944 a quarter of the V-1 launch sites had been put out of action by Allied aerial attacks. On June 13, 1944, even though only 10 of the 55 V-1 launching ramps were ready for action, the first flying bombs, traveling at 360 miles per hour, flew from their bases in northern France, each loaded with 2,000 pounds of high explosives. The aiming point for the V-1 was London's Tower Bridge, and it took only 22 minutes to reach this target. Of the 5 successfully launched flying bombs that day, 1 fell into the English Channel, 3 landed in open areas on the English East Coast, the 5th hit a railroad bridge killing 6 people and injuring 9. On June 15 and 16, the missile offensive was resumed from 55 operational V-1 sites, which delivered 144 bombs on southern England, 73 of which struck London. For the next 3 months the Battle of the Flying Bombs was fought over the counties of Kent and Sussex, as well as London, with the Germans firing an average of 97 bombs a day at the capital. Due to the weapon's speed, British anti-aircraft artillery was helpless to combat the menace. By the end of August, 2,224 V-1s had dropped on England, killing 5,476 British subjects and destroying thousands of homes and many factories. It was only repeated Allied air attacks and the advance of their ground forces in France and Belgium that caused the Germans to dismantle their V-1 bomb installations in those regions, ending the V-1 Blitz by September 1. Although the V-1 danger was finished, a far more serious missile threat was initiated by the Germans, the V-2. Fired from Holland, the V-2s used mobile launchers. In transit, the 12-ton, 46-foot-long rocket was laid out on a Mayar wagon trailer, which not only transported the weapon but served as its firing platform. Any small clearing would do to launch the V-2, and it only took an hour to prepare and fire the missile, which could gain an altitude of 55 miles and a speed of 3,580 miles per hour with a range of 200 miles. Just 4 minutes after takeoff, the V-2 could come crashing down on London. With the program now controlled by the SS, the first V-2s were fired at Paris and London on September 8, 1944, from the area around The Hague in the Netherlands. During the next weeks, more rockets, V-1 and V-2s, hit London, with 82 falling on the city in November, killing hundreds of civilians. Antwerp was hit by 924 rockets up to the end of the year, while a total of 447 were aimed at London. The last rockets of the war were fired from The Hague on March 27, 1945. The final V-2 exploded in London, killing 134 people and injuring 94 others. In total, Hitler's V-2s killed 2,754 and wounded 6,523. After V-1 flying bombs and V-2 guided missiles rained down on wartime Britain, Hitler had one more murderous retaliation weapon surprise, the V-3, codenamed Hochdruckpump, high-pressure pump. The V-3, or London gun as it was sometimes called, was in effect an artillery piece. Following the initial firing charge that forced the projectile up the barrel, a series of secondary charges placed in lateral chambers along the length of the barrel, spaced 3 yards apart and fired electronically, would detonate, adding to the propellant's pressure and thus increasing the projectile's velocity and range to a maximum of 102 miles. The V-3 supergun projectiles were 9 feet long, finned, and fitted with a 300-pound high-explosive warhead. The site for this new weapon, planned for the installation of a 50-gun battery, was a cavernous 2-mile labyrinth of concrete-lined tunnels and galleries dug out by forced labor near the village of Mimoyac in the Pas-de-Calais area of northern France. The largest guns ever manufactured, the V-3 barrels were 412 feet long. Made of soft steel with 6-foot bores in diameter, and all fitted with conventional breech-loading mechanisms. The V-3 site at Mimoyac was first bombed by the British Royal Air Force on November 5, 1943, with negligible results. A test firing of the Mimoyac V-3 battery by the Germans delivered 7 shells onto the town of Maidstone near London on June 13, 1944. This surprise bombardment prompted a massive Allied bombing raid, using 106 Handley Page Halifax 4-engine bombers against the position on July 6, 1944, which destroyed the site with Tallboy bombs. By August, the Germans, due to the extensive damage to the battery, abandoned the facility. In September, the region fell into the hands of the Canadian First Army as it swept through the Pas-de-Calais from the Normandy beachhead. While jet bombers and fighters could somewhat retard Soviet and Western Allied ground advances, and V-1 and V-2 missiles could exact revenge for the massive Allied bombing of Germany, what Hitler needed most was a weapon to defeat the huge number of Russian and Allied tanks confronted by the German army. In 1941, Hitler demanded the production of a heavy tank to replace the lighter machines of the earlier war years. The design of what was to be the Tiger I tank did not come about as a response to the Russian T-34 and KV armored fighting vehicles encountered during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Instead, Hitler's main concerns were combating British tanks and anti-tank guns. However, after the appearance of the T-34 and KV, the design and production of an effective heavy panzer was pursued with increased urgency. Preliminary work on a heavy tank design had begun in 1940. At a meeting with Hitler on May 26, 1941, it was decided that the new heavy tank prototype should be ready by the summer of 1942. The tank's weight would be 45 tons, its frontal armor 100 mm thick, with 60 mm side armor, and the main gun would be the 88 mm Flak 41. Lastly, The armor-piercing round had to be able to punch through the frontal armor of Allied tanks at 1,500 yards. The firms of Porsche and Henschel were contracted to design competing models for consideration. Porsche had a head start in the process since Hitler had commissioned the company in late 1940 to work on such a design. In fact, in 1941 Porsche had received a government contract to produce 100 heavy tanks. In October 1942, the German Army Tank Development Department ran comparative trials at its training center at the Böblingen tank testing grounds outside the city of Stuttgart and decided the Henschel heavy tank was superior to the Porsche model. The Henschel model, designated VK45.01H, was not created through a controlled design process defined by careful systematic conceptual design stages. Instead, it was a rush job, quickly assembled from a mixture of components available from a previous medium Panzer designed for a 36-ton tank Henschel planned to produce. Now this design, along with other heavy tank technology made for different tank models, was to be transformed into a heavy 45-ton armored fighting vehicle. For example, a previous 30-ton tank design from Henschel came with the Maybach over 40 12/16 transmission, steering gears, and suspension system. From the Porsche design came the 100mm turret gun mantle mounting the 88mm KWK 36-liter/56 cannon, even though the Army wanted the more effective 88mm Flak 41 model to be used. The only new major components in the Henschel were the Maybach HL210 P-45, 12-cylinder power plant, fuel tanks, cooling system, and deep fording equipment for crossing rivers. The VK45.01H driver's front plate armor was 100mm sloped at 9 degrees. Other protection included front nose plate armor of 100mm at 25 degrees, side armor at 80mm at 0 degrees, hull plate armor of 60mm at 0 degrees, rear armor of 80mm at 9 degrees, and deck plates of 25mm at 90 degrees horizontal. 92 rounds of ammunition, 46 armor-piercing and 46 high-explosive, were stored in the vehicle. An MG-34 heavy machine gun was placed coaxially to the right of the main gun while another MG-34 could be mounted on the cupola ring for anti-aircraft defense. At 57 tons, this armored beast could move at a maximum road speed of 28 miles per hour and off-road speed of 13 miles per hour and had a range of 120 miles. In early March 1942, the design was identified as Tiger. The Panzerkampfwagen VW Tiger I, 88mm length/56, SDKFZ 182, Ausführung was introduced in March 1943. Between April 1942 and August 1944, a total of 1,350 Tigers were delivered to combat units on all fighting fronts. Under combat conditions, the Tiger I's shooting capability was accurate at 1,000 meters. This was enhanced because the turret traverse was outfitted with a hydraulic motor for the turret drive. The speed of traverse was dependent on the engine speed. The ability of the Tiger I to negotiate obstacles and cross terrain was as good as or better than most German and Allied tanks. For example, it could cross a 2-yard wide ditch, ford a waterway a yard deep, and climb gradients up to 35 degrees. Initial automotive problems with brakes, drive chain, and leaking seals made the tank hard to maintain in the field, but following modification of the defective parts, a Tiger could be kept operational in combat for as long as most World War II armored fighting vehicles. Battlefield survivability was a key asset of the Tiger I. Its main 88mm gun assured it could destroy any Soviet or Allied tank with a frontal shot out to 200 yards, while American-made Sherman tanks with their improved 76mm cannons had to be within 100 yards to do the same to a Tiger I against Russian tanks such as the T-34-85 and JS-122. The Tiger could penetrate frontal armor up to 400 and 100 yards, respectively, whereas the T-34-85 had to be within 100 yards and the JS-122 500 yards to knock out a Tiger frontally. The Tiger
On February 15, 1942, Houston sailed with a small Allied convoy to reinforce the garrison on Timor, fending off numerous Japanese air attacks. The next day, the Japanese attacked in full force. Houston's anti-aircraft fire saved the convoy from destruction.
At the very last of the bombing which took place, of these 45 planes, 3 at a time would come over and drop bombs on the fleet there. and drop bombs on us. And we were able to dodge until the very last group of planes came over. One bomb hit our turret 3 and knocked it out and killed about 50 men. We continued to convoy ships from Port Darwin up to the island of Timor. During convoying those ships, we were attacked more than one time by Japanese bombers to bomb the ships and to bomb us, but we were never hit again.
February 27, 1942. Houston, along with Allied cruisers and destroyers under the command of Royal Netherlands Navy Admiral Karel Doorman, encountered a Japanese naval force commanded by Admiral Takeo Takagi. Both fleets opened fire in a battle that severely damaged and sunk Allied ships. Doorman orders his 4 remaining cruisers north to stop the invasion of Java. Japanese torpedoes sank the 2 Dutch cruisers, one of which took Doorman with her. Before losing his life, Doorman ordered Houston and the Australian cruiser Perth to retire.
All of the ships were either sunk or put out of action, except the Houston and the Australian light cruiser, the HMAS Perth.
On February 28th, Perth and the USS Houston, retiring as ordered, came across the Japanese invasion force with tired crews and low ammunition.
We had entered the strait, the Sunda Strait, and we, of course, were all blacked out. The Perth ship, the captain of the Perth ship was a little older than our captain, so he was in command of our 2 ships.
Together, Houston and Perth engaged the Japanese, but Perth, the first to engage the Japanese ships, comes under heavy fire. She was gone within an hour.
But all of a sudden, about 11 o'clock, the Perth in front of us opened fire. And she was firing at destroyers. And of course, immediately we found out we were in the midst of a landing party, of a Japanese landing. There was at least a destroyer on each side of us for the entire time we were in there. And when we were firing at them and they were firing at us, if we fired at them, we had to either be going so we could go broadside or forward head on. We could not be leaving the enemy and firing a defensive fire. So we saw the Perth burning, and we saw her disappear. And she had about the same percentage of survivors that we had. Not too many. And then after she sank, we lasted until almost another 40 minutes.
Houston, alone, fought the enemy all around her, but began to lose headway after taking torpedo damage. Shortly after midnight, the ship came to a stop after a bursting shell fragment killed the ship's commander, Captain Albert H. Rooks. Japanese destroyers stood in closer, machine gunning her decks.
Damage done to our ship was at least 3, if not 4, or maybe even more torpedoes on our starboard side. Plus, while we were firing at them, they were firing at us surface fire. They killed a lot of our topside personnel. We watched our ships sink, bow first, as the big starboard list. and the stern was high. And it didn't last long. It was only a very few minutes. And we saw our flag still flying from the mainmast. Our battle flag, which flies at night as well as daytime.
The Missionary Brigade was activated in Quantico, Virginia as a 3rd Provisional Brigade. As World War I raged in Europe, the United States required stabilization closer to home. The brigade commanded elements of the 7th and 9th Marine Regiments and was sent to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to quell rebel violence in the region. The brigade was then relocated to Galveston, Texas as a contingency force before being deactivated in 1919. Rising tensions in China in the late 1920s began to threaten the lives and property of American citizens, requiring the need for more military strength. The 3rd Brigade was then activated once again on March 28, 1927, and deployed to Shanghai, China, under the command of Brigadier General Smedley Butler. History remembers them as the first of the China Marines. The brigade was then deactivated and reactivated again in the midst of World War II on March 21, 1942. The brigade deployed to Western Samoa, arriving with roughly 5,600 officers and enlisted personnel, armed with heavy artillery to defend the island. Civil and political unrest in Laos, South Vietnam's vulnerable neighbor, necessitated Marine combat troops to help stabilize the situation. The brigade was reactivated on May 19, 1962, and deployed to Udorn, Thailand, to assume command over all Marine ground and air elements in the area. As the needs of the Marine Corps in Vietnam waxed and waned, so did the need for the newly designated 3rd Marine Amphibious Brigade. Reactivated on April 23, 1965, the brigade landed at Chu Lai, South Vietnam, to establish an airfield. 6 years later, as the war drew to a close, the brigade was activated on April 14, 1971, in Da Nang, South Vietnam. The brigade took on the task of finalizing the redeployment of Marine units from combat zones before
a P-51 cost $51,000 in 1945, or about $675,000 today. The Enforcer would probably have cost around $1 million. The A-10 Warthog cost almost $19 million apiece. Nonetheless, a modernized Mustang was a curious choice. The P-51 had made its reputation in 1944-45 as an air superiority fighter that was fast, maneuverable and, most importantly, long-ranged enough to escort B-17 and B-24 bombers deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. But with its lighter frame and liquid-cooled engine that would seize up if hit, it was not the ideal ground attack aircraft. That honor was reserved for the heavier, clunkier but remarkably tough P-47 Thunderbolt. Unfortunately, the Air Force junked the Thunderbolt after World War II, which meant the more fragile Mustangs were used for ground attack in Korea, and took heavy losses in the process. Re-engined with the Lycoming T-55, which powered the CH-47 helicopter, as well as an ejection seat and other upgrades, the PA-48 may have looked like a Mustang, but most of its components were new. It had a maximum speed of 345 miles per hour, almost 100 miles per hour slower than P-51. Then again, it would have been strafing Viet Cong, not dogfighting Messerschmitts over Berlin. While the P-51 had a bomb load of 1,000 pounds, the PA-48 could carry a respectable 6,000 pounds of bombs or rockets, which is more than some modern fighter jets carry. Incredibly, through the 1970s, Lindsay and Piper pitched the Enforcer not just as a coin aircraft, but also as America's primary ground attack plane. That role happens to be fulfilled by the A-10. It's one thing to offer a prop job for a niche role like Bush Wars, but quite another to suggest it should replace a jet as a primary ground attack aircraft. Not surprisingly, the Air Force said no thanks. But Lindsay, who had been a newspaper publisher, persistently lobbied Congress until the Air Force awarded Piper an $11.9 million contract in 1981 to build two prototype PA-48s for evaluation. War is Boring's Joseph Trevithick obtained a copy of the Air Force test report through the Freedom of Information Act. While the testers found the Enforcer easy to operate and maintain, they also concluded it was underpowered.